Unit 4, Biological Psychology. Presentation 3, Life Changes as a Source of Stress.
In this presentation, we'll be looking at the impact of life changes as a source of stress. Events in our life such as the death of a loved one, divorce, or a son and daughter leaving home are often referred to as critical life changes because they require a major transition in our lives. Because of this, they can be a major source of stress.
Although the term life change suggests that something must have happened to cause a person such stress, it can be just as stressful when something doesn't happen. For example, losing out on a promotion at work or not getting to university are both extremely stressful life not changes for many people.
The idea that life changes could be linked to illness was first proposed by two doctors, Thomas Holmes and Richard Rohr. In the course of treating their patients, they observed that periods of physical illness were frequently preceded by major life changes. These changes could be positive, such as marriage or the birth of a child, or negative, such as divorce or the death of a spouse. The significant factor in determining how stressful these events were was the degree of change necessary in the person's life in order to deal with them. In order to investigate this link more carefully, Holmes and Rohr developed the Social Readjustment Rating Scale, or SRRS.
The SRRS contains 42 life events taken from their analysis of over 5,000 patient histories. The 42 events are ranked in terms of how much readjustment would be needed by the average person were they to experience that particular event. Holmes and Rohr gave marriage a score of 50 life change units. Events that would involve a greater adjustment were given a higher score, and those requiring less adjustment were given a lower life change score.
The life event that was judged to require the greatest readjustment in a person's life was the death of a spouse. This would represent 100 life change units, followed by divorce at 73 life change units, and so on. At the other end of the scale were relatively minor life changes, such as going on holiday at 13 life change units and Christmas at 12 units.
Holmes and Rohr suggested that a score of 150 or more life change units over a 12-month period increased an individual's likelihood of illness by 30%. A score of 300 or more increased the odds of illness by 50%. Let's look at a study that made use of the SRRS to explore the relationship between life changes and illness.
Research on the role of life changes as a source of stress. In 1970, Richard Rohr and US Navy colleagues published their study testing the relationship between life changes and subsequent illness among Navy personnel. They wanted to see if there was a relationship between life changes experienced prior to a naval tour of duty and the number of reported illnesses during that tour of duty.
This correlational study was carried out using 2,664 officers and men aboard 3 US Navy ships about to set off on a 6 to 8 month tour of duty. The mean age of the men was just over 22 years, and they came from a variety of backgrounds. The researchers used an adapted military version of the SRRS called the Schedule of Recent Experiences, or SRE for short. Each man's SRE score for the 2 years prior to their tour of duty was obtained, along with all illnesses that each man experienced through the 6 to 8 months at sea.
The researchers found a positive relationship between the number of life change units measured by the SRE over the previous 2 years and the likelihood of getting ill while at sea on their current tour of duty. A positive correlation means that as life change units increased, so did the frequency of illness. The total number of life change units for the 6-month period, immediately before the current tour of duty, showed a significant positive correlation with illness while at sea. The men who scored low in terms of their SRE scores also had low levels of illness while at sea, while men with high SRE scores experienced correspondingly high levels of illness.
Criticisms of Holmes and Ra's study. This study showed clear support for the hypothesized relationship between life changes and illness. As illnesses were routinely reported to the sick bay aboard ship for treatment, data could be collected without having to rely on subjects' memories. This is a clear strength of this research, as there are often concerns over the accuracy of people's memories for illnesses experienced over such a lengthy period. However, it is worth pointing out that the illnesses experienced by the men while at sea were generally minor, and their life changes prior to the current tour of duty were usually of relatively low significance.
A more recent study into the impact of life changes was carried out by Keren Michael and Hasida Ben-Zur. They studied 130 men and women with a mean age of just under 50. Half of these men and women had been recently divorced and the other half recently widowed. So, both groups had experienced significant life changes, but would they experience comparable stress levels?
The researchers found that levels of life satisfaction were higher and stress levels lower in the divorced group after their separation. The opposite was true among the widowed group. They reported lower levels of life satisfaction and higher levels of stress after the death of their partner.
This seems to go against what we might have expected because these are both high-scoring life changes on the SRRS, so both groups should have experienced high levels of stress. Why do you think that wasn't the case?
The suggestion offered by the researchers was that the divorced group were more likely to have been dating a new partner, therefore felt less stressed and more satisfied than the widowed group. They were also more likely to be using a coping strategy called problem-focused coping, which involves turning the experience into a positive rather than a negative experience. The divorced group, therefore, were more optimistic than the widowed group, and this was reflected in their greater life satisfaction and lower levels of stress.
Evaluation of the role of life changes as a source of stress. A first problem with using the SRRS as a measure of life changes and illness is that positive and negative life changes appear to have different impact. The SRRS appears to indicate that any life-changing event has the potential to cause health problems because it requires significant readjustment. For example, the scoring system of the SRRS would suggest that both retirement and being fired would have the same impact, as they are scored the same in terms of life change units. Critics would argue, however, that only undesired, unexpected and uncontrolled changes tend to be really harmful. As a result, events such as being fired would be experienced as more stressful and so would be more likely to lead to stress-related illness.
A second problem is that most studies in this area have produced correlational data only. As a result, they failed to establish a causal relationship between life changes and stress-related illness. It's possible that some of the items on the SRRS are not causes of illness, but consequences. For example, divorce and redundancy may well lead to depression, but an individual with depression is also more likely to experience subsequent relationship and work problems. It's also possible that a third variable affects both life changes and illness. For example, people with high levels of anxiety report more negative life changes and are more prone to illness. There are huge individual differences in how we perceive specific life changes and therefore how stressful we find them. For example, the impact of pregnancy depends largely on whether it was planned or even desired, and even relatively minor events, such as Christmas and going on holiday, can be extremely stressful for some people. For a lonely old person, the death of a much-loved pet can have a far more devastating effect than more significant life changes such as personal injury or illness. Because the impact of these life changes varies so much from person to person, it becomes hard to predict illness from SRRS scores alone.
So what can we conclude? Research has shown that life changes can be a source of stress, but fortunately most major life changes are relatively rare in people's lives. Consequently, researchers have switched their attention to the impact of daily hassles, those minor irritants such as a missed bus or broken phone, as a more significant source of everyday stress. Research by Anita de Longis and her colleagues in 1988 found a significant relationship between health and daily hassles, but not between health and life changes.